Good morning. This is Marlene Tadros. My guest today is Dr. Nezar AlSayyad, renowned architect, planner, urban historian, and public intellectual. He is an emeritus professor of architecture and planning at the University of California at Berkeley, where he was faculty director of the Center of Arab Societies and Environment Studies and chair of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies for over 2 decades. Dr. AlSayyad holds a BS in Architectural Engineering and Diploma in Town Planning from Cairo University, an MS in Architecture from MIT, and a Ph.D. in Architectural History from UC Berkeley. He is the author and editor of many books on architecture, some of which we will discuss in this episode. His books have been translated to 6 languages, and he has won several awards. Dr. AlSayyad, welcome.
Thank you, Marlene. It's a pleasure to be with you.
So this is our English edition, but I think we will talk about some of the similar stuff in the Arabic edition and some stuff that is different.
Yes.
Now, the question I must ask is, how do you make architecture so engaging? I mean, you have, I personally didn't think that architecture could be so related to all these multiple disciplines, and you make it so engaging because it includes history, it includes politics, it includes sociology.
You know, it's very interesting that you asked this question, because I'm not really sure that at this very specific moment in academic discourse that what I do is fundamentally different than what many of my colleagues do. Winston Churchill once said, we make our cities and they make us in return. And I think it's that very specific connection, if you will, between human beings and their creations of material culture. Architecture, in the end, is not at all different than other forms of expression, like literature, like poetry, like art. The difference is it's lived. So while many of the other forms of expression are individual, and are received and accepted by a larger public, architecture is never a product of a single individual. The making of the built environment itself includes many, many forces. So even if you have an individual who has a very strong will and can produce certain forms, certain built forms, it's the action of the populace that makes a difference in this case. It's also that architecture, and I prefer to use the built environment, is also a product of many factors, which include climate. It also includes the social relations of individuals. Sometimes it includes issues like what is it that we can actually build with? So it includes material. So in a sense, it is the arena in which many of these things come together. In the past, when I studied architecture, not only in Egypt, but even in the United States and in Europe, as it was studied back in the 50s, 60s, and even until the 70s, the approach was one where the focus was always on style. So you'd study buildings by understanding different styles, Gothic and Renaissance and modern, so on and so forth. That approach came under a great deal of scrutiny and criticism, I would say in the 80s. And a new approach that tried to understand architecture as a product of this larger context of the interaction of many of these forces came into being. And in a sense, I'm one of the contributors to this approach. I certainly am not the only one. Maybe I'm one of the few who actually attempted to do it with a focus on the countries of the global south, and more specifically on the Middle East and Egypt.
You bring Cairo in particular. It's one of the foci of your books and of your writings. You have about 4 books on Cairo alone, and you bring it to life. So you have this, you started with the streets of Islamic Cairo, in 1981, which was published by MIT, and Cairo Histories, which is another very, very important book. And I know that you say that, of course, there are many histories. Your current book is, or a book that you're working on, is Cairo, the Rootledge Handbook on Histories, Representations, and Discourses. Can you speak more to these books and especially to your current project?
Yes, indeed. I'd be very glad to do so. It's always a pleasure to speak about a book that hasn't come out yet, that is information, although I have to say, this is an edited volume that includes the who's who of Cairo scholarship. But to be able to answer your question, I, in a sense, have to put it in the context of your first question, which is, why am I so interested in Cairo? My earlier interest in Cairo goes back to the time in which I was a student at the University of Cairo. And our curriculum at the time was in the School of Engineering in the Department of Architecture, which is still in Egypt part of engineering, unlike it is in other parts of the world, was one that was geared much more towards Western and European material. That, for example, the study of Cairo itself as a city was almost completely absent from my curriculum. I got interested in it, ironically, not so much during the time that I was in Egypt and attending Cairo University, but when I went to MIT. I had a very specific hypothesis, because during the time that I was in Cairo, I would always visit the area that we now talk about as Islamic Cairo or Fatimid Cairo, which is basically a small area, 1 kilometer by 1.5 kilometers, used to be surrounded by a wall, the wall of Old Cairo itself. And much of it is relatively well preserved. We decry, of course, some of the changes that have occurred to it lately, but I would never forget entering from Bab Zuwayla, walking this mile until you get to Bab al-Futuh. You encounter somewhere between 15 to 20 buildings that are in excellent condition. An excellent condition because many of them are actually 800 years old and 600 years old and 500 years old, and they've undergone many restorations in the past, some of which were restored 500 years ago. But it's fascinating because they are actually different styles. I got very interested in that, and in fact, I decided that I want to understand, why is it that this street is so attractive? Why is it that it functions so well? And I remember when I actually got a minor fellowship from MIT to go and spend the summer to study it, I met people who live in the street who were not only unaware of its history, but didn't really care for its buildings. They thought that this is the past, we're interested in the future. I was interested in the past because of the fact that I felt that there was something there that we can capitalize on as architectural designers today. And that was the recognition that the placement of buildings in certain locations was done in such a sensitive manner that I had not seen elsewhere. I had not seen in European architecture. I had not seen in modern architecture. So if you walk that street, you would be fascinated by the number of minarets and domes and their appearance on the street. They are always competing for your attention. They are placed in such a manner where they are vistas to different people from different streets that open into this major spine. Their proportions are so elegantly made in a manner that you always have to ask, how come that they appear here? And so, for example, there are minarets that you can see if you walk the street from one direction, but you would never see if you walk the street from the other direction. And you ask why? Why is that the case? Well, it was partly wayfinding, so the architects were aware of that. Partly it was the attempt to distinguish your building from everything else, and yet at the same time contribute to the overall aesthetic scene of the city itself. So I ended up doing this book, which it was just a thesis. The ArchiCom program at MIT was recently established, and they decided after I finished it and after I graduated that they wanted to publish it. And I was very pleased because in a sense, it was my first book, almost 40 years ago now. from that, I was absolutely convinced that there's a lot to do on Cairo. But at the same time, I wanted to do other things. So I moved away from Cairo. I did not return to do anything on Cairo until a few of my friends, Nasser Abbat, who was still is the director of the Aga Khan program at MIT, Rini Bierman, who was then the chair of art history at UCLA, and Tim Mitchell, who was also then the director of the Kevorkian Center at NYU. So here you had 4 people who were interested in Cairo, who've done work on Cairo, who are chairing Middle East centers and departments. And we all have an interest, in this case, in the 19th century. We all use different kinds of maps to study the city. And we actually discovered that some of the maps that we use are not necessarily maps that are similar. We found that there's tremendous variations in the maps. So for example, you actually find a building one time to the east of a street, and then 50 years later in another map it appears to the west of the street. So I mean, that was fascinating for us. How is that the case? And so we decided to just have a symposium to compare our maps, and from it emerged a research group that we called the Misr group, after Egypt and Cairo being called Misr, as you know, by many Caireans. And we added members to the group, different members to the group. And in the process, we actually discovered that much of the work that the Comité de Conservation de Caire, which did much of its work in the 19th century, was really interested at times in preserving some buildings. And the way they went about doing that was, in fact, to often buy a building and move it, disassemble it and move it elsewhere. A practice that became later very common in the 20th century in the heritage and conservations of buildings. Basically that was, you can argue, my second book. It's an edited volume on Cairo. Then my third book is a book that I, as I told you earlier, I very much resisted doing. It's called Cairo: Histories of a City. And I got an invitation from Harvard University Press to do this book. And I recognize that part of the reason that I got that invitation is there has been a seminal book written by the eminent historian, sociologist Janet Abulot back in 1970 that everybody was using. And it became a bit outdated. I think they actually went to her and they asked her to do a new book. And that time she was retired and old, and she decided, no, you should ask Nezar to do that book. I have to say that I was very reluctant to do it, and I actually kept saying no. But they offered me a tremendous advance, which, as an academic, you never really get for a book. Yes. And in a sense, I ended up agreeing to do the book. And I used this approach that I was talking to you about, where for me, there isn't really a single history of a city. When I first studied architecture at the University of Cairo, I studied from a book called The History of Architecture by Bannister Fletcher. And then when I went to MIT and then later to Berkeley, I realized that there's no the history. There isn't a single history. I studied with Spiro Kostov, who was an eminent historian at the time. And he had also written a book called A History of Architecture. So that's a difference, that it's a history of architecture. The approach that I used in doing Cairo Histories of a City was slightly different because I recognize that it's a history, but it's not one history, and it's not my history. So I told the history of the city by looking at different historical periods. To be more specific, 12 historical periods. I decided to tell the history of each period from one particular spot in the city, one square, one building, one space, one garden, and not to tell my history of it, but rather the history of someone who lived in that very specific time. So in a sense, it is told in my language, but it's about what someone like, for example, Ibn Khaldun, who had lived in Cairo during the time of the Bahai Mamluks and had worked as a major judge, qadi in the city itself. And had documented a lot of those things. So, you know, I had to search for where did he live? What did he do? What was the city like during his time? And then I did the same, for example, for the Mamalik al-Jarkisa, the Burgi Mamluks, using Maqrizi. I did the same for Cairo of the 19th century using Ali Mubarak, so on and so forth. So in a sense, the idea was to allow the residents of Cairo and sometimes the visitors of Cairo to sort of speak to what they saw and let the reader get an idea of the diverse views of the city itself. Ironically, the book, which I finished in 2010, ends with a chapter about Tahrir Square. And that was very interesting because I basically make fun of the name of the square, because I ask, you know, Tahrir is liberation. And I said, liberation from what? Is it liberation from, you know, the British who were there for a good 70 years? Is it liberation from the forces of capital? Is it the Egyptians coming to terms with their own identity? And the book was released in January of 2011. And Tahrir Square happened, you know, the Egyptian revolution happened. And I remember my publisher actually, you know, freaked out. She said, so what do you want to do? Should we do an errata? Should we change, you know, this? And I said, no, you know, the book actually came out in 2011 in January. But if you look at the introduction, it has my signature at the end of the preface, in which I basically say, I put the date. It was like October of 2010. So in a sense, these events happened after. But Harvard then decided that what they want to do is to have me put something on their website that explains what's happening in the square. And this was back in like February, March. So there was still a lot of activity around the square. And I did that. And it was very successful because they had so many hits on the website that the Washington Post approached me and the New York Times approached me. And I ended up actually writing for the New York Times something that was published in March of, so after Mubarak stepped down, of 2011, which the New York Times changed its title to Cairo's Roundabout Revolution. It was a brilliant change of title, which I had not envisioned. And what they did was they took the entire last page of the newspaper, and they took my article, and they gave it to an artist who brilliantly decided to use the space between the columns to illustrate what was happening in Tahrir Square. So you can actually see the space between the columns as if, you still find it on the web, but it's very small, as if in one of them there are people coming, carrying banners and demonstrating. Then from the other one, there's tanks coming. And from the third one, there are like donkeys and camels, you know, because of what had happened in the square in February.
In reference to the Arab Spring.
Yes, exactly, in reference to the activities of the Arab Spring. So the book actually did extremely well. And even though it's an academic book, it sold almost as if it's a popular book. And I attribute it mainly to Tahrir Square and to the Egyptian Revolution, and not to the power of the idea of histories of a city.
Do all cities have different histories? Could you say the histories of New York, for example?
Oh, absolutely. Oh, absolutely. In fact, I think that that's the whole premise, at least, of what I do as an urban historian. My belief that history is always told from the perspective of the present. And there's no history that is ever told without an intent. There's no pure history. There's no neutral history. It is always formed by not only the intention of the historian, but by his or her upbringing, by their knowledge and exposure, and not only to their discipline, but to other disciplines, and sometimes by the availability or lack of archival material. So we have very different forms of also telling history. You know, oral history has become very important, where you talk to people before they die and you record something, and it becomes a very valuable instrument for the future. Or even sort of things like today, there's what's called family history. Family history allows you to tell the history of a city and the history of interaction of people within the neighborhood from the perspective of family documents, letters that people wrote to each other, tax documentation, records of birth and death and marriage certificates, so on and so forth. So there are ways by which to do that. And I have to say, in Egypt, we have some amazing people who have pioneered, the telling of history using these different approaches. Someone like Khalid Fahmy, who I actually consider to be the eminent historian of modern Egypt, both in the 19th and the 20th century, because he has this capacity to use these different techniques based on the story that he wants to tell. So yes, of course, there are different histories. And since you also raised that, part of the reason that I'm working on this book, which hopefully comes out at the end of this year, called Cinematic Cairo, is precisely that I actually think that the city itself has been documented and captured, but also imagined, because films have the capacity to project an image that may not be there, but it's in the mind of the director, and it's in the script that is followed by the actors. And
it's different from reality.
Yes and no, because for me, and that's the reason that I started this project with a group of young scholars in Cairo. I had written, somewhat extensively about film and the connection between cinema and the city in general. And my initial focus was actually on New York and London and Paris and Lisbon, and it was not on Cairo whatsoever. And a lot of people blame me for that. How can you be a Cairo expert and not having done that? And I have to say, in my defense, I lived for 42 years outside of Egypt. So I lost contact with Egyptian films. And although I'm very familiar with what existed in the 60s and the 70s, everything else for me was a blur. So I had to re-educate myself. And this group that I put together, and I worked with them for 2 years, really educated me about this time period. And it was a lot of fun to be able to understand that. So the premise of this book is that if you want to understand the transformation of the city itself from a traditional city at the end of the 19th century to a modern city by the end of the 20th century, cinema is one of the most important instruments that will allow you to do that. But I'm also interested not simply in what was captured on film, but how different directors, different authors at different times from the 1920s understood and projected an image to the city that ultimately impacted people's perception of the city. So I was just actually writing about this a few months ago, and for me, the connection between what I call real Cairo, R-E-E-L, and real Cairo, R-E-A-L, is not only strong, but it's also mutually constitutive. As in, there are many people whose knowledge of Cairo is only based on what they see on television and in cinema, period. That is the Cairo for them. That is the Cairo that will always be in their mind. And it's very interesting because, again, we know from research that when people go to visit the city for the first time, they actually seek what they see or what they saw in this virtual medium in cinema. So Cinematic Cairo, which will be published by the American University Press at the end of this year, is a book that is mainly focused on the changes that occurred in the representation and the imageability of the city over almost 100-year period, from the 1920s with some of the earliest films, all the way until I think the last film that we use is 2018. And it's by different people. It is periodized. So we have, films from the 30s, films from the 40s, films from the 50s. We engage the politics of the time. We engage the themes that were present in Caireans' social life at the time. But we're also interested in the physical environment. What happened, what happens when Cairo becomes a neoliberal city, in which capital not only dominates, but determines every single aspect of movement and communication and transportation and wealth and earnings and jobs, so on and so forth. So that's basically the book that will come out. The book that you asked me about, I have to say, is one of the most difficult books that I have ever engaged with. And I'll repeat its title again because it's a long title. It's called Cairo, the Routledge Handbook of Histories, representations and discourses. And you can see that it's divided into 3 parts. Each part takes a theme that is really important. So, for example, in the histories part, we have chapters that deal with the Fatimid city. We even have a chapter that deals with Cairo before Cairo, about Fustat and Al-Qataya, 2 cities that existed in this area before Al-Qahira, which became Cairo, was actually built. Then we have chapters on the Mamluks, we have chapters on the Ottomans, we have chapter on Cairo of Muhammad Ali, we have chapters on Cairo of Gamal Abdel Nasser, and we continue, with the idea of representations. Here, what we're really trying to do is to understand how Cairo was discussed and narrated by different people. So there's Cairo in popular sayings and proverbs. What is it that people said about Cairo itself? There's Cairo in songs and music. There's Cairo in photographs. There's Cairo in graffiti, the graffiti that was actually done not only during the revolution, but before and after, and what does it really tell us about the city? So that's the part. There's actually a chapter by me on Cairo in cinema as well, which is in a sense very much inspired by the book that I just told you about. And then the last part deals with contemporary discourses. The issue of will Cairo be Cairo if you're building a new administrative capital? The tremendous problems that exist in Cairo with regard to the informal sector area, as you know, al-ashwaiyat, which constitute about 70% of the entire built fabric of the city. Can you remove them? Can you fix them? What do you do with them when they actually constitute the bulk of the urban fabric, and many of which are not necessarily even upgradable because of their location, because of their density, so on and so forth. But there are lots of other things that are also engaged in this part that sort of widen the scope. That it's also about what's happening in Cairo today in terms of the music scene, what is happening in Cairo today in terms of the tourist scene, what's happening in Cairo today in terms of the real estate development scene, so on and so forth.
It's completely fascinating. I would read that in a heartbeat.
I'm sorry, this was a long narrative, but I wanted to make sure that since you started with the Streets of Islamic Cairo, that we end with this, which hopefully will be out by 2022. So
you brought up some very important points, and I will get back to these, like the informal settlements and like the new administrative city that's being built outside of Cairo. But before we do that, I want to talk about the Nile, since we talked about Cairo.
Yeah.
I'd like to talk a little bit about the Nile itself.
Yes.
So, of course, rivers create civilizations.
Yes.
They're always around a certain river. How has the course of the Nile changed over time and affected the architecture surrounding it? And of course, a second part to that question, which is a bit, although related, but it's not entirely architectural, the Renaissance Dam.
Yes.
What do you think will happen?
Well, all Egyptians are usually fascinated with the Nile. It's sort of part of life in Egypt. And when I actually did my book on the Nile, I think I was under the same kind of spell that most Egyptians are under. There's that famous saying, I'm sure you know it, that whoever drinks from the water of the Nile will always get back to it.
Absolutely.
Despite the fact that many people today talk about the fact that the water of the Nile is no longer as pure as it used to be. In fact, sometimes the water of the Nile is problematic.
Yeah.
And the irony is that people who say that, which is a fact, sometimes come under the arm of the law and are prosecuted for saying that. And in addition to, of course, the current and the greatest threat to Egypt, particularly that the water of the Nile may not be forthcoming as it used to be in the past, mainly because of the Grand Renaissance Dam that Ethiopia is building. Setting some of these issues aside, I would still say that it's really important to recognize, and I took that attitude in writing my book, that Egypt is indeed the gift of the Nile, but the Nile is also the gift of Egypt. And it's the gift of Egypt because of the fact that without the Nile, ancient Egyptian civilization would not have existed, but it's ancient Egyptian civilization, its use of the Nile, that created the contemporary Egypt and that put the Nile on the map of important sites in the world. It is the thing that made the Nile so fascinating to many people. I have a chapter in the book that talks about how is it that discovering the source of the Nile had always fascinated people and rulers in particular from the time of ancient Egypt till the 19th century. Hundreds, maybe thousands of people lost their life trying to discover the source of the Nile. The discovery of the source of the Nile in the 19th century, and this may take us to the Renaissance time as well, was as significant in the middle of the 19th century as and in terms of world fascination, as the idea of traveling and landing on the moon in the middle of the 20th century. To the extent that when you see who funded what, so you find that the Royal Geographic Society of Britain, the Germans, the Habsburg Empire, the French, they all funded missions to discover the source of the Nile. And some of these missions actually came from the north and went down south and encountered major problems getting to the source of the Nile. Others came from East Africa, from what is today Tanzania, and they moved west, if you will. Others came from West Africa and moved east. And I found that fascinating. I ended up having to actually allocate an entire chapter in the book to this particular topic. And I did that because I realized there was a journal called the Journal for the Discovery of the Source of the Nile. This was an academic journal. And that academic journal was issued with support of the Royal Society of the UK. And it continued to be issued until the 1940s. So it's a journal that almost lasted for 80 or 90 years. And it had an issue once a year or once every 2 years, something like that. Why? Because every time someone discovered the source of the Nile, someone else came and said, oh, no, but there's another source, or there's a different source, and what have you. Of course, the notion of a source of the Nile in and of itself is mythical, because there is no river that has one single source. In fact, not just that, there isn't a single river that has not only one single source, they have many, many, many sources. One of the things that I do in the book is I actually have a map, which I call the 99 sources of the Nile. And I know that 99 is not even accurate. But you can trace that. You can actually identify that there's water coming from here and from here and from here. And that's one of the things that I focused on. And the reason is that when someone discovered, for example, the most southern source of the Nile, someone else came again and discovered the longest source of the Nile, which is not necessarily the most southern source of the Nile. Then someone else came and discovered the highest source of the Nile in terms of elevation. So in fact, the latest discovery actually happened during World War II. You have a German explorer by the name of Waldecker, who was a geographer and a Jew, escaping Nazi Germany, ended up going to West Africa. By that time, we had known quite a bit about Lake Victoria. We had known quite a bit about Lake Nana, the two origins, if you will, of the Blue Nile and part of the White Nile. And Waldecker started his trek to sort of see where he can, find the longest source of the Nile. And actually, he did that in the 1940s. And the site today is in the country called Burundi. And it's very interesting because what he did was he built a pyramid there, almost as a tribute to, this is where the Nile starts and this is where the Nile ends. But ironically, then later someone else came in the 1990s and with some funding from a number of geographic societies, discovered another source of the Nile that makes the Nile longer and established it as the longest river in the world. And this is in the country called Rwanda. So it's very interesting that you actually see, these differences. So going back to your question about how does it relate to cities, The Nile was very important in bringing life to cities in the first place. Water is very essential, not only for agriculture, but for human survival. And early on, if we look, for example, at the cities that ancient Egyptians built, they had this love and fear relationship with the Nile. Love because they considered the Nile very important. They worshipped the Nile. There was a god for the Nile. Yet at the same time, they knew that the Nile can also be uncontrollable and can create, during the flood seasons, major damage, not only to crops, but to cities. So cities managed to avoid being close to them. They were close enough to the Nile, but not too close so as to suffer its damages during the flood season. And actually, that's a pattern that continued all the way throughout history until, basically the 20th century, when the old Aswan Dam was built and then the High Dam was built. In fact, one can argue that it's only in the 20th century that the banks of the Nile, as we know it today, in many parts of Egypt, but particularly in Cairo, are so secure. They haven't changed. So we can actually see that the banks of the Nile, for almost 100 years are the same. That was absolutely not the case for the 1,000 years that preceded that, even in Cairo itself. Even, for example, during the time of Muhammad Ali or the time of Khidawi Ismail, the area today, which is Tahrir Square, the Nile used to flood a considerable part of that area, totally flooded. And that's the reason that it remained green almost until, the 1800s, until 1820, 1830. It was not really anything. It was agricultural land. Why? Because it was subject to flooding. And it's only finally with the construction of the Aswan Dam, the first Aswan Dam in 1906, that there was a degree of control that would guarantee that this area, which was then later built, if you will, into downtown Cairo and was called Ismailiyah, then started to develop. And it started to get closer and closer and closer to the Nile with structures like the Hilton Hotel, which is now the Ritz-Carlton. And it's very interesting because that site was the site of the British barracks since the 1890s, since the British occupied Egypt. So it's very interesting to sort of see how the Nile shaped cities. In the book, I have a map that I did not produce. I took from the work of hydrologists who study the history of water, that show exactly how the Nile moved sometimes to the east, but sometimes to the west, over a long period of time, to the extent that the movement was substantial. The Nile moved maybe 3 to 4 kilometers after floods, because the power of the water would actually carve a new path. And when the floods recede, there would be a different kind of Nile or a different channel. And that channel then becomes the bigger Nile. And all of the others become the sort of the smaller canals coming out of it.
Fascinating history. So what do you think the dam is going to do then?
Yes, the dam, there's quite a lot of fear in Egypt about the dam. And I have to say it is definitely fully justified, although slightly exaggerated. No one controls, water. Water is not completely controllable. It's a product of rain much of the time. With climate change, there is, at the moment, drought in many parts of the world. And other parts of the world that used to experience some, rain and snow and what have you, are actually having more of it. So climate change is not just simply global warming. It's global warming in certain parts of the world and the opposite in other parts of the world. What is happening right now in Ethiopia is that we are not really sure of how the larger phenomena of global warming is going to impact the patterns by which rains would fall, and hence will impact how much water would flow down the Blue Nile. The Blue Nile is actually the source of about 65% to 70% of the water of the Nile. And so Egypt particularly depends more. As you know, there's the Blue Nile and the White Nile. They meet right north of at Khartoum, and they continue all the way their journey, a good maybe 2,500 kilometers all the way to the Delta and to the Mediterranean. So Egypt, much more than any of the other countries, depends on the water that comes from the Blue Nile. The Ethiopian plan is to build this Renaissance dam that will generate electricity for a very good reason. I mean, they have a rationale, which is they need to electrify their villages that had no electricity quite for a very long time now. By the way, this is exactly the same argument that was used by Gamal Abdel Nasser to build the Aswan High Dam back in the 1960s and 70s. And he was absolutely right. I mean, he ended up having to do it politically by nationalizing the Suez Canal because he could not get international funding. But the real issue was he needed to industrialize, he needed to provide better quality of life to Egyptian villagers. And that's what the Ethiopian government was trying to do. The conflict right now rests completely on the rate by which the Ethiopians are going to start to fill the reservoir behind the Great Renaissance Dam. It's no more than that. The Ethiopians are being inflexible because they believe they have that right. They are also being inflexible because they need to fill the reservoir to be able to generate that electricity. What Egypt and Sudan are simply asking for is to extend the time period for the filling of the reservoir, which would not allow the Ethiopians to generate enough electricity. I do hope that conflict will be resolved. It's very difficult to know where it is. Sometimes the saving grace is nature, and that's actually what's happening in the first phase of filling the reservoir, because as you know, the dam is being built on phases. So there's phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. So when the Ethiopians built phase 1, there was exactly the same kind of fear that exists today, but the amount of rainfall was so substantial that the water in the reservoir overcame the dam. So whatever water they stored, it was not sufficient. Now, one of the things that is also happening now is that they've built the second phase, and they are starting the filling of the dam, which in this case would mean not allowing water to go through until they reach that level. And that's where the danger lies. However, if the rainfall rate continues as it was last year and the year before, it will not be a great crisis. If global warming impacts the rainfall in Ethiopia in a negative way, as it has in other countries around the world, then Egypt will definitely have a problem. The estimates is that it would lose a good 20% of its arable land, its agricultural land. Again, all of them are estimates because, as I said, it completely depends on what will happen rainfall-wise. It also depends on whether Egypt and Ethiopia reach an agreement. It also depends to a great extent, and I have to say that that's the saving grace in the Egyptian case, on the reservoir that is behind the Aswan High Dam, Lake Nasser, because Lake Nasser will absolutely sustain all of Egyptian needs for the next 3 years. The Egyptians are worried beyond the 3 years, and they're absolutely right to do so.
Okay. What about the informal settlements? So you mentioned them in passing. It is an international phenomenon.
Yes.
What is the solution to it in Egypt in particular? I mean, in general, but in Egypt in particular, because what Egypt has been doing recently is just demolishing some of these settlements and moving people somewhere else.
Yes, and it's very interesting because I think actually the attitude of the Egyptian government towards the Ashwaiyat, the informal settlement areas, is not independent of the current attitude of the government and the current prime minister specifically, who happens to be an architect planner, towards the notion of building in the desert and building new things and building new communities. After all, he was the director or the chair of an organization called the Organization of New Communities, the National Organization of New Communities. So I think the two are very much tied. What to do with the informal settlements is a $6 million question. And it is so because this is not only a very difficult question, and it's not only an issue or problem that Egypt is facing, but many other parts of the world are facing. The solution to it is not and cannot be universal. There isn't an approach of, oh, let's demolish and just move people elsewhere. Why? Because this was tried in many other parts of the world and completely failed. It was total failure. I'm sure that many planners in Egypt know that. So why is it that they're still engaged in this? I think the engagement in this is purely political. You have a leader who has decided that he will eradicate informal settlements without a full understanding of what informal settlements actually are. Informal settlements is what people build on their own without abiding by building codes, without building in the proper manner, without getting a permit, building it on agricultural land. So there's a lot of negative stuff here. But the most important aspect of this is that many of these people had no other alternative. It's not like, oh, they did that because they wanted to violate the law, or they did that because they have no respect for the law. In fact, if anything, Egyptians always want to stay within the confines of the law. It's just that they violate it whenever it is that they discover they can't. They can't even survive, within it. And as such, I think it's very unwise that the current policy of the government is eradication of informal settlement areas. They cannot do it. They cannot do it. They cannot do it in the lifetime of the current regime, definitely. What is a better approach? A better approach is what has been tried in many parts of the world, in places like Brazil, for example, where you upgrade settlements that can be upgraded. Not all settlements can be, but you upgrade. And in Brazil, there's upgrading of settlements that exist even on mountaintops, on hills, which are very difficult to bring electricity to, very difficult to bring sewage and water and what have you. In Egypt, I think that the major issue in the upgrading of informal settlements, and unfortunately few people have written about that, because it is from an urban perspective, urban policy perspective, it's not only that it's an unsolvable problem, it's a problem that gets you as a planner very depressed because your hands are tied. So what do you do with structures that are 8 and 9 stories high, that don't have elevators, that overlook streets that are only 2 meters wide, very unhealthy conditions, very crowded conditions, density-wise, no air that comes into these units, no sun that comes into these units. So the natural instinct of a planner and of even a public health official is that you have to demolish these. But then what do you do with these people? The numbers of people that you have to deal with is amazing. Had Egypt invested the money that it invested in the building of the new capital to build settlements for these people, I can understand. They actually have built quite a lot. But at the same time, the state now has become almost like a developer, a real estate developer. The state is building housing with and in cooperation with developers, multinational developers at times, mainly for a different class of people, for those who can afford to buy these expensive units. The upper classes, the elite, and even I would say the upper middle classes, those who have worked in the Gulf for 20 years and can afford to now buy something in one of these gated communities. So had the government invested this money, perhaps there would have been a possibility of saying, okay, we're going to accommodate 1/3 of all of the people who live in informal settlements, and we will demolish them. Now, mind you, there is a number of informal settlements today that exist on land that is very valuable, very valuable. Why? Because the city grew around it. And these areas now are in the middle of the urban area. I'll give you 2 examples that most Egyptians know, and some of the international experts may know as well. The Maspio Triangle and the island of Warraq, Jazirah al-Warraq. Both of these were, old settlements, informal. They, one was agricultural land that was taken over time and now houses thousands of people in the island. The other one was actually an area that was formal. So it's not exactly informal. It's a formal area, but over time, it got densified and became like a slum. So there is a difference actually between the 2 areas, but the government considers them both ashwaiyat, which is interesting because legally they're not. So the attitude of the government, okay, we're going to remove people from these areas. We're going to move them to other areas like the neighborhood that they called Hay al-Asmat, which is, nicely designed, but at the same time, it's no different at all than the public housing that we have seen built during Nasser's time, that completely collapsed over time, and where the quality of the units became so bad that the government had to give them up. The government ultimately gave them for nothing to the people who lived in them. They made them owners of it, which I actually applaud, because they could not have maintained them anymore. So at least allow those who live in them to maintain them. So I cannot, as someone who's actually spent a good deal of my professional life studying informal settlements and wrote a book about it, I do not have a single solution. I actually think that the solution lies in this case in a case-by-case basis, in being able to map the informal settlements, being able to designate which of them can be saved and which cannot be saved. The blanket statement that they all cannot be saved is ridiculous. In recognizing, of course, at times that the market also has its demands. So I fear that the residents of the Maspero Triangle, for example, they may have been given units slightly better than what they lived in. And some of them, in fact, opted to take the financial compensation instead, which is good. But my concern is you go and put them, in some distant satellite community, which is, 30, 40 kilometers from where they used to have jobs and had economic activity. You're also cutting their possibilities of income earning. And these they're not even middle-class people. Some of them are poor people. So I think a lot more thought should go into that. At the moment, we have a regime that is intent on, we're going to do this, and we're going to do it this way. Sometimes this works, but in the context of a country like Egypt, where individuals have always found other ways to deal with these situations and to exist outside of the law, I don't think it will.
We have a flurry of building bridges in all across, crisscrossing all of Egypt, actually all of Cairo in particular. Are bridges the solution?
Yes, this is a phenomenon that I've seen the last time I actually was in Egypt. And again, the bridges, and they're not really bridges. We call them bridges in Egypt, but in reality, all over the world, they're just simply called overpass. Because it's not like we are crossing an edge of a city. We're crossing a river or some natural. We're just simply, deciding to re-traffic the area by creating passageways that allow cars to travel, more easily. And it's very interesting because, again, when you think about it, here the privilege is given to the car. So people who drive cars are the ones who are benefiting from this. Who are the losers? The losers are pedestrians. The losers are people who live in the neighborhoods in which these overpass have actually been built. The mentality that created the overpass to solve a traffic problem is exactly the same mentality that decided we're going to eradicate all informal settlements and build housing instead. It's exactly the same mentality. You can argue it's an authoritarian mentality. It's a military mentality. And it happens, it happens. And it has happened even in Europe. Paris, that we admire so much, was actually almost a product of a period of that sort. It was a crowded city. Baron Osman, under Napoleon III, was given the mandate to facilitate the movement of traffic. And he came and he cut major boulevards into the city in a thoughtful way, but it was still major boulevards. And many people were displaced. Many people were removed from these properties. But then when you look at it today, Place de la Concorde, Place de l'Étoile, all of these were a product of that very specific time that sort of carved into the old city and created the great city that we all enjoy today. That, unfortunately, that is not happening in Egypt right now.
I was
not at all.
So maybe it will be a new Paris.
No, it won't. That's the government claims that, but again, this has to do with not actually understanding the lessons of urban history or the history of urban design. So the focus here is on traffic. Baron Osman's focus was on creating a new city in which its different nodes are connected to each other, not only physically. Although I have to say, again, as a historian, I have to take that into account, that all of these changes happened in Paris after there was a revolt in which ordinary people took over the city.
Mhm.
And Paris was actually a commune that was a republican, that was totally against the monarchy, and a commune in which people were militant to defend their right to be in control. There is no king anymore. When this entire system collapsed, the commune of Paris collapsed, the idea of the new regime, which after a while declared itself a monarchy, again, Napoleon III decided he's an emperor, again, was okay, we want to make sure that this doesn't happen. So how do you make sure that it doesn't happen? You carve these big streets so that armaments and military forces can easily access these neighborhoods and control them immediately. So you don't have to engage in the battles that occurred in Paris between the forces of the monarchy, the monarchists, and the republicans, which lasted for years. And in a sense, Paris was barricaded, and ultimately the republicans lost. But as we know, ultimately the republicans won, and Paris and France became a republic after several times of going back to being a monarchy. So I don't know. I think that there is a degree of frivolity in the building of these overpass. And unfortunately, as you probably know, accidents have increased as a result of it. Pedestrians have a hell of a time. As an urbanist, I look at this and I say, okay, well, we have to wait for 20 years and see what this has done, because at the moment, their immediate impact is not positive at all. In fact, it's negative.
In your book, Cities and Caliphs, which I remember I read it when it first came out, and I had reviewed it for you in the Al-Ahram Weekly.
Yes.
At the time.
Yes.
A long time ago.
Yes.
You said that building cities cannot be separated from the caliph or the ruler.
Yes.
And they are basically shaped by the caliph and the ruler's perspectives.
Yes.
This happened, of course, we saw this more recently in Egypt. First of all, is it an international phenomenon? I mean, we saw it in Egypt with Sadat and Mubarak. Every one of them built, Sadat city, Mubarak built other cities. Everybody wants to build their own cities. Now we see it in the administrative city on a much larger scale, with the highest cathedral and the highest mosque and the biggest and largest and tallest and things like that. Is it a local phenomenon?
No, it definitely is not. I think that the notion that people in power, either because they are visionaries or because they want to leave a legacy, or because they
think they are visionaries.
Yeah, but yeah, I understand that. I'm not necessarily speaking about a particular individual here, but in any case, or because there is actually a need. It's very interesting because I actually think that the notion of needing a new administrative capital is not something that anybody in Egypt, that many planners in Egypt would disagree with. The question is not whether you build, and it's very interesting because initially it was actually called the new administrative capital. Now everybody's calling it the new capital, which cannot be, because the Egyptian constitution insists that Cairo is the capital. So I don't know how they're going to resolve that. Maybe they're going to extend the urban cordon of Cairo to include it, or maybe they're just going to call it New Cairo or something like that. But the phenomena itself that you're talking about is as old as time. Each ruler, each king, each emperor, sometimes each president comes in and decides to build this thing because it's needed. Actually, it happened partly during Nasser's time. And this was the first time that this really happened, because Cairo was getting very congested, particularly in the 50s and the 60s. And his approach was to build new government complexes that had not existed, like, for example, CAPMAS, الجهاز المركزي للتعبئة والإحصاء, or the Ministry of Planning. These were basically governmental functions that had not existed at all in Egypt before. So if you look at it from that historical perspective, during Nasser's time, many ministries stayed in their old location, like, for example, the Ministry of Interior, Wazarat al-Dakhliya, and others were actually, because they're new functions, they were built in this new area, which was called Madinat Nasr. In that area, there was a planning technique. There was something that was designed there to make it the new area. It was actually quite successful in the 60s and 70s. And it was also if you will, the natural expansion of the city, because Cairo itself starts with a very small Byzantine Roman fort. And, over time, that fort expands. So much of Coptic Cairo existed around that fort. And with the arrival of the Arabs, then you have Fustat, and then you have Al-Askar, and then you have Al-Qutaya, and then you have Al-Qahira, which is Cairo. And then you have what actually continues to be built northeast of that. So in a sense, the new administrative capital, NAC, as many researchers call it now, NAC, which is an interesting name, that capital itself is located in an area that is not northeast. It's in fact real east, and it is much more connected to the road that is going to Suez and to Ain Sukhna. What's very interesting, as you know, is that they decided that they're going to build this highway speed rail between Alamein all the way to Ain Sukhna, passing by the new administrative capital.
Yep.
A very strange project. Yet at the same time, in a very interesting way, from a planning perspective, it assumes that there's no country, and that the country is constituted of these two growth poles, as they're called, and that everyone is going to move to them, and that transportation between them would be so important and essential. And it's very interesting because that road is designed in such a way where you actually have like 4 stops. There's a stop in Alamein, there's a stop in Ain Sukhna, there's a stop in the administrative capital, and there's a stop outside of Cairo, because the idea is to even avoid Cairo altogether, as if it does not exist. The outside of Cairo is for people who live there to go there so as to go there. So it's really weird that the location was chosen. The location also, like unfortunately many other cities in the desert, and David Sims has written nicely about that. It's not necessarily a site that has access to water. It's not necessarily a site that has access to famous heritage sites. It's not necessarily a site that has fantastic climate. It's a site that exists where there's also a major Magarat Siyul that will create puddles of water if it rains. Yeah, and so but the advantage of the site is that it's a tabula rasa. It's a blank site where you can do anything and you can do everything, and that's the reason that they had that. If you don't pay money to get the land, that is a major,
How will it get water? How will it get water?
Yes, well, at the moment, that is not a completely resolved issue. It's at the moment it's getting water from the Nile, because that's what you need.
Right.
In the future, it will have to definitely get water from water distillation plants on the Red Sea. That's or in the Gulf of Suez. I cannot imagine that it will. And again, there are many cities in the Gulf that are like that. It's just that Egypt was not a country that depended so much on that. But unfortunately, it has to, because of the Grand Renaissance Dam. I think it's actually very wise for the Egyptian government to make sure that all of the cities that on the Mediterranean, on the Red Sea, and on the Suez Canal, including in this case the new administrative capital, that all of these completely depend on water distilled from salty water of the Mediterranean or of the Red Sea, and because the water that actually is coming from the Nile, even if you assume that you will have a very good deal with Ethiopia, would be rarely sufficient to feed and to at least quench the thirst of Egyptians who live in the Nile Valley and the Nile Delta. So that's not a bad thing that they are planning this, I think. Now, with regard to that, it has the biggest or the tallest, mosque. Or again, and this is an example I gave you. I cannot, as an urban historian, I can tell you lessons from history that may have a future impact, but I cannot predict what will happen. So the example that I often use, in a strange way that allowed people who want to defend the capital take it out of my context and they use it to support their own, is look at the country look at a city like St. Petersburg, built by Peter the Great in the worst possible site in Russia, because of a complex that Peter the Great himself had, that he didn't really think the Europeans considered him European enough. So he wanted to move the capital to the closest part of Europe. He chose a site that is very inappropriate, that is very cold all year round, that is, again, full of water much of the year. And he built it in such a manner where he really forced the majority of the elite of Russia to build there. And the city, for the first maybe 100 years or so, 80 to 100 years, that never picked up. It only picked up, it became important after it was established, and because of other political reasons that occurred in Russia, in which Moscow as a capital lost its importance and its power, and St. Petersburg had to serve this function. And so again, it's a city of very interesting history, because as you know, for much of my childhood, it wasn't called St. Petersburg, it was called Leningrad. And then, it changed again after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and it regained its name. Today, St. Petersburg is the most visited city in all of Russia, and a beautiful city, no doubt. Perhaps the new administrative capital over 200-300 years is going to be like that. It requires a lot. It requires maintenance. It requires vision. It requires better planning at this time, not in the future. We'll see.
Well, this was, this was the way Sadat envisioned his own city when he built the Sadat city. And then he was assassinated, and the person following him, Mubarak, did not continue that project, which is why the project died. The point is, if this new capital is not finished pretty soon, when this president is there, the person coming after him will just ignore it, and all this money is going to go to waste.
That's very possible. And in fact, many people have actually written about the new capital, new administrative capital, simply as a ghost town, or that as a town that will be a ghost town, like happened with Ashara Ramadan, 10th of Ramadan city, or with Sadat. But I make a distinction, because when Sadat actually established or had the idea of Sadat city, it wasn't called after his name because he wanted it. It actually emerged from a very specific planning paradigm at the time. And the notion was that it was not going to be a new capital. It was never announced as a new capital.
No.
It was going to be a place where some of the functionaries of the ministries that do not require to be in Egypt were going to be there. In fact, if you visit the city today, you'll actually find signs until today which designated this is going to be for the Ministry of Education, this is for the Ministry of Public Works. And but the idea here was that some functions don't have to exist in Cairo itself, which was right. And I'm not really sure that Sadat city failed simply because Mubarak came to power. I wouldn't attribute its failure to that. I would attribute its failure, and it has failed, and Ashara Ramadan, 10th of Ramadan, to a totally different phenomena, that Egypt had contradictory urban policies exactly at the same time. In fact, the first paper I ever wrote as a scholar, when I was still a student at MIT, was a paper that looked at this was in the late 70s, early 80s, because what Sadat had put in place initially, right after the 73 war and with the peace treaty, is the notion that Cairo has become too big and you need to decentralize.
Right.
So they came up with 3 cities. Each was supposed to have, in 10 years, 1 million people. 10th of Ramadan, Al-Amriya, which is next to Alexandria, which is now called something else, and Sadat city. They started these projects. They were very well planned. In fact, I would argue that these 3 towns, 2 of them at least, maybe even slightly better planned than the new administrative capital, because they involved international consortiums. There was amazing feasibility studies done. There was studies about where water is going to come from. There were studies about where labor is going to come from. There were studies about what kind of industry will occur in each, which function will actually be in each. It was not just a single authoritarian decision that was meant to, we need to move people elsewhere, and we need to have a new capital. But at the same time, and in the late 70s, early 80s, and unfortunately, that's the policy that continued under Mubarak. So here's where your statement may be partly true. There was this adoption of a different policy, which is satellite cities. Satellite cities that are supposed to be bedroom communities to address the demand for housing in Cairo, outside of Cairo, but very close to Cairo. So the 2 policies are contradictory. Are you encouraging people to move 100 and 200 kilometers away, or are you putting something that is 20 kilometers away? The policy of the satellite bedroom communities around Cairo, which in this case included 6 October, Shu, Qahira Gadida, totally killed the policy of new towns away from Cairo, killed it. So I would say that the failure of Sadat City was more a product of the contradictory nature of urban decisions in Egypt. By the way, that contradiction still exists today, as I just told you, which is the notion that you are going to, demolish, ashwaiyat, demolish informal settlements, and move people, away. But at the same time, you are still creating concentration because you are taking these areas and building extremely dense sites, but for the upper crust of Egyptian society and for developers from abroad. So you're not like solving the major problem that exists in Cairo, which is it's a city, it's one of the highest densities, residential densities in the world. It's a city that has the least agriculture, has the least green area per capita. So the least that you could do is, yes, remove these settlements, but turn them into parks, because that's what is really needed if you care for the human beings who live in the city itself.
Dr. Nezar AlSayyad, renowned architect, planner, teacher, historian, and a lot of other things. An artist, I should mention artist as well. You paint.
A little bit.
No, a lot.
Yes, but I paint buildings only. I want to make sure that people understand that, because a lot of people talk to me now thinking I'm a painter. I am an architectural renderer. I learned these techniques at Cairo University using mechanical drawing systems, and I still enjoy doing it. So I paint buildings. I render buildings.
They're brilliant, and I have the pleasure of having 2 of them hanging in my house. So, and they're, of course, about Cairo. So, thank you very much. This was a delightful interview.
Thank you, my dear. It's a pleasure to be with you.